The champagne bubbles danced against my lips as I watched Cordelia Thane Whitmore glide across the manicured lawn in her ivory silk gown, her second attempt at wedded bliss unfolding beneath a canopy of white roses and baby's breath. The afternoon sun cast everything in golden hues, and I couldn't help but admire how perfectly orchestrated this celebration was. From the string quartet positioned near the gazebo, to the servers weaving between guests with silver trays of d'oeuvres that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. My husband Lysander stood several yards away, deep in conversation with his cousin Bartholomew near the champagne fountain, their heads bent together in what appeared to be serious discussion. I'd been married to Lysander Whitmore for nearly 28 years, and I'd learned to read the subtle tensions in his posture, the way his shoulders would set when something troubled him. Today, however, I'd attributed his occasional fidgeting to the usual discomfort he felt at large family gatherings, particularly those orchestrated by his younger sister. Cordelia had always been the dramatic one in the Whitmore family, the sort of woman who approached life as if it were a stage production, requiring elaborate costumes and carefully scripted dialogue. Her first marriage to Edmund Hartwell had lasted exactly 3 years and 4 months, ending in what the family politely referred to as irreconcilable differences, though everyone knew it had more to do with Edmund's gambling problem and Cordelia's inability to tolerate anything less than perfection in her carefully curated existence. Now, at 41, she was marrying Donovan Ashford, a successful architect from Portland who specialized in restoring Victorian mansions. Donovan seemed pleasant enough, though I'd only met him twice before today, both times at family dinners where conversation remained safely superficial. He had kind eyes and an easy laugh, qualities that seemed to complement Cordelia's more intense personality, and I found myself genuinely hoping this union would prove more durable than her first attempt. The reception was being held at the Whitmore family estate, a sprawling property that had been in Lysander's family for 4 generations. The house itself was a magnificent example of colonial revival architecture, with its symmetrical facade, white columns, and perfectly proportioned windows that overlooked 30 acres of meticulously maintained gardens and woodlands. Cordelia had transformed the south lawn into something resembling a fairy tale setting, complete with market lights strung between ancient oak trees and table arrangements that probably required the services of 3 different florists. I'd spent the morning helping with last-minute preparations, though helping might be too generous a term for what amounted to following Cordelia's increasingly frantic instructions, while she directed an army of caterers, florists, and wedding planners with the precision of a military commander. By the time guests began arriving at 3 o'clock, I was more than ready to step back and simply enjoy the celebration as a guest, rather than an unpaid assistant. The ceremony itself had been lovely, conducted by Reverend Pemberton in the garden pavilion that Cordelia's great-grandfather had built in 1927. Donovan's vows were heartfelt and personal, speaking about finding unexpected love later in life and his gratitude for Cordelia's willingness to trust again after disappointment. Cordelia's response was more theatrical, as expected, but genuine in its emotion, and I found myself blinking back tears when she promised to build a life based on honesty and mutual respect. Now, 2 hours into the reception, the celebration was in full swing. The older relatives had claimed tables near the house, where they could observe the festivities while remaining close to air conditioning and restroom facilities. The younger crowd had gravitated toward the dance floor that had been installed near the garden pond, where Cordelia's college friends were attempting complicated moves to songs that had been popular when they were in their 20s. I was perfectly content standing at the edge of the festivities, nursing my second glass of what I suspected was extremely expensive champagne, and watching the intricate social dynamics play out around me. Lysander's family had always fascinated me with their elaborate protocols and unspoken hierarchies, so different from my own middle-class upbringing in Ohio, where family gatherings involved potluck dinners and conversations that rarely required careful navigation of sensitive topics. Aunt Genevieve Whitmore Sterling had positioned herself at what she clearly considered the most advantageous table, surrounded by her adult children and their spouses, holding court like a benevolent monarch surveying her kingdom. At 78, she remained the family's unofficial matriarch, the keeper of traditions and arbiter of what constituted appropriate behavior for members of their social circle. Her influence extended far beyond family matters, given her involvement in numerous charitable organizations and her position on the boards of several cultural institutions. Uncle Percival was regaling anyone within hearing distance with stories from his recent European tour, gesturing expansively with a martini glass, while his wife Millicent nodded along with the practiced patience of someone who'd heard these anecdotes countless times. Their daughter Ophelia had brought her new boyfriend, a young man who seemed overwhelmed by the grandeur of his surroundings and kept checking his phone as if expecting rescue from some external source. The Ashford side of the wedding party appeared more relaxed, though perhaps that was simply because I was observing them as an outsider, rather than navigating the complex emotional currents that always seemed to swirl beneath the surface of Whitmore. Family events. Donovan's parents, Harold and Judith, seemed genuinely delighted by the match, and his sister Beatrice had spent the afternoon taking photographs with the enthusiasm of someone documenting a particularly wonderful vacation. I was contemplating whether to approach the dessert table, where an impressive array of petit fours and chocolate-covered strawberries beckoned, when I noticed Lysander walking toward me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. His face had gone pale beneath his summer tan, and his usual confident stride had been replaced by something that looked almost like urgency. "Evangeline," he said, reaching for my elbow with more force than necessary. "We need to leave. Now." The abruptness of his statement caught me completely off guard. I looked around at the celebration continuing around us, at Cordelia laughing with her new husband near the wedding cake, at the string quartet beginning another waltz for the couples who had begun dancing on the lawn. "Leave?" I repeated, certain I'd misunderstood. "But we just got here. The reception started 2 hours ago, and I was planning to stay for the cake cutting. Cordelia specifically asked me to help coordinate the gift table after dinner." Lysander's grip on my arm tightened. "It's too long to explain. We just need to go. Right now." There was something in his voice I'd never heard before, a quality that made my stomach clench with sudden anxiety. In nearly 3 decades of marriage, Lysander had always been measured in his responses, the sort of man who approached problems with methodical analysis rather than emotional reaction. Even during our most difficult periods, when his business faced challenges or when we'd struggled with fertility issues in our early years, he'd maintained a calm rationality that had often served as an anchor for my more volatile emotional responses. "Lysander, you're scaring me," I said, searching his face for some explanation. "What's wrong? Did something happen with your mother? Is someone sick?" "Please," he said, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Trust me on this. We need to leave immediately, and I'll explain everything once we're away from here." The intensity of his plea overrode my confusion and growing irritation. I set down my champagne glass on the nearest table and allowed him to guide me toward the side of the house, where cars were parked in neat rows along the circular driveway. My mind raced through possibilities as we walked, each more troubling than the last. Had there been some kind of family emergency? A business crisis that required immediate attention? Some health issue that Lysander had been hiding from me? As we reached our car, I caught sight of Cordelia across the lawn, her face radiant as she posed for photographs with Donovan's elderly grandmother. Whatever crisis had prompted our departure, she appeared blissfully unaware of it, lost in the joy of her wedding day. I felt a pang of guilt at leaving without saying goodbye, without offering an explanation for our sudden absence. Lysander's hands shook slightly as he started the engine, and I noticed beads of perspiration along his hairline despite the comfortable temperature. The short drive to the end of the estate's private road passed in tense silence, broken only by the sound of gravel crunching beneath our tires and the distant sound of music from the reception we'd abandoned. It wasn't until we reached the main road that Lysander finally pulled over, parking beneath a cluster of maple trees that provided shade from the late afternoon sun. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment with his hands gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead as if gathering courage for whatever he needed to tell me. "Lysander," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended, "you need to tell me what's happening, right now. This behavior is completely unlike you, and you're frightening me." He turned to face me then, and I saw something in his expression that made my heart begin to race. It wasn't just anxiety or stress, it was fear, deep and genuine, the kind that comes from confronting something you'd hoped never to face. "At the reception," he began slowly, "I was talking with Bartholomew near the champagne fountain when Aunt Genevieve approached us. She seemed agitated, more so than usual, and she asked to speak with me privately." I waited, my hands clenched in my lap, dreading whatever revelation was coming. She told me that she'd been going through some old family documents recently, papers that had been stored in the attic of the main house for decades. Legal documents, financial records, correspondence dating back to the 1950s and 60s. Lysander paused, running a hand through his hair in a gesture I recognized as his way of buying time when facing difficult conversations. Among these papers, she found a sealed envelope that had been left by my grandfather before he died in 1978. The envelope was marked with instructions that it should only be opened in the event of certain circumstances that Aunt Genevieve believes have now occurred. My confusion was growing rather than diminishing. What kind of circumstances? What was in the envelope? The envelope contained a letter from my grandfather, along with copies of legal documents and what appears to be a confession of sorts. "Evangeline, the information in that envelope calls into question everything our family has believed about our history, our wealth, our very identity." The way he said confession made something cold settle in my stomach. I thought about the Whitmore family's carefully maintained reputation, their position in society, the charitable foundations and business interests that formed the foundation of their social standing. "What kind of confession?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. Lysander was quiet for so long that I wondered if he'd changed his mind about sharing this information. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "My grandfather's letter reveals that the money that established our family's fortune, the investments that built our business empire, the funds that purchased the estate and supported our lifestyle for generations, weren't obtained through legitimate means." I felt the world tilt slightly around me. "What do you mean?" The letter details a series of financial manipulations and fraudulent schemes that my grandfather orchestrated in the 1940s and 50s. Real estate fraud, investment scams, insurance fraud, embezzlement from various business partnerships. The scope of it is staggering, Evangeline. Everything we've built, everything we've inherited, everything that supported our family for 70 years is built on criminal activity. The implications of what he was telling me crashed over me in waves. I thought about our comfortable lifestyle, the private schools our children had attended, the charitable donations we'd made with such satisfaction, the sense of security that had come from being part of an established, respected family. "But that was decades ago," I said, grasping for some way to minimize the impact. "Surely there's some statute of limitations, some way that this doesn't affect us now." Lysander shook his head grimly. "The letter indicates that my grandfather never made restitution to any of the people he defrauded. In some cases, entire families were financially ruined by his schemes. According to the documents Aunt Genevieve found, he kept detailed records of his victims, apparently planning to make amends before his death, but never following through." I tried to process this information, to understand what it meant for our present situation. "Why would your aunt tell you this today? Why at Cordelia's wedding?" "Because," Lysander said, his voice heavy with resignation. One of my grandfather's victims was Harold Ashford's father. The name hit me like a physical blow. Harold Ashford, Donovan's father, the kind-faced man I'd chatted with during cocktail hour, who'd spoken so warmly about gaining a daughter through this marriage. Donovan's grandfather lost everything in one of my grandfather's real estate schemes in 1954. The family business, their home, their savings, everything. Harold's father spent the rest of his life trying to recover financially, but he never managed it. He died in poverty in 1983, still believing he'd been the victim of legitimate business failure rather than deliberate fraud. I stared at Lysander, struggling to comprehend the cruel irony of the situation. Does Harold know? Does Donovan know? Aunt Genevieve believes Harold may have discovered the truth recently. She's heard rumors that he's been researching his family history, looking into the circumstances of his father's financial ruin. If he's uncovered evidence of my grandfather's involvement, today's wedding takes on a very different meaning. The pieces were beginning to form a horrible picture in my mind. You think this marriage isn't what it appears to be. I think, Lysander said carefully, that we may have been manipulating ourselves into a position where we're vulnerable to exposure, or worse. If Harold Ashford knows what my grandfather did to his family, this wedding could be the beginning of a very calculated form of revenge. I thought about Donovan's courtship of Cordelia, which had seemed so romantic, so perfectly suited to her need for grand gestures and emotional intensity. Their meeting at a charity gala, his persistent but respectful pursuit, his apparent willingness to embrace the Whitmore family traditions and expectations. But Cordelia, I said weakly, she loves him. You could see it during the ceremony, the way she looked at him. Cordelia has always been susceptible to men who know how to present themselves well, Lysander replied, not unkindly. Remember Edmund and how charming he seemed until his true nature revealed itself. If Donovan has been specifically targeting her as part of some larger plan, she would be the last person to recognize it. The sound of cars passing on the main road reminded me that life was continuing normally for everyone except us, that just a few miles away, Cordelia's reception was progressing exactly as planned, with guests dancing and laughing and celebrating what they believed to be a joyous occasion. What are we supposed to do with this information? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Lysander had shared. Do we confront Harold? Do we tell Cordelia? Do we contact lawyers? I don't know, Lysander admitted, and the uncertainty in his voice was perhaps the most frightening aspect of this entire conversation. Aunt Genevieve is meeting with the family attorney tomorrow morning to discuss our options, but she wanted me to be aware of the situation immediately because of my position in the family business. I realized then that I'd been thinking about this. Crisis primarily in personal terms, but Lysander's concerns extended far beyond our immediate family. As the current head of Whitmore Industries, he bore responsibility for protecting not just our family's reputation, but the livelihoods of hundreds of employees, the interests of business partners, the stability of various charitable foundations that depended on Whitmore funding. How many people know about this? I asked. Right now, just Aunt Genevieve, myself, and you. But if Harold Ashford has uncovered the same information through his own research, there's no telling who else might be aware of it. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the road. I thought about Cordelia, probably cutting her wedding cake by now, surrounded by family and friends who had no idea that their celebration might be unfolding under false pretenses. We have to go back, I said suddenly. We can't just disappear from her wedding without explanation. She'll never forgive us, and our absence will only create more questions. Lysander looked at me with surprise. Evangeline, you don't understand the gravity of this situation. If my suspicions about Donovan's motivations are correct, we could be walking into a trap. Then we need to know for certain, I replied, feeling a surge of determination that surprised me. We can't make decisions based on speculation and fear. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with before we decide how to respond. I could see Lysander weighing my words, his natural caution warring with recognition that I might be right. If we go back, we have to be extremely careful about what we say and do. No confrontations, no accusations, nothing that could escalate the situation until we have more information. Agreed, I said, though my heart was racing at the thought of returning to the reception with this new knowledge coloring every interaction. But we need to be there. We need to observe, to listen, to gather information. And we need to protect Cordelia, even if she doesn't realize she needs protection. Lysander started the engine with obvious reluctance, and we drove back toward the estate in heavy silence. As we approached the entrance, I could see that the reception was still in full swing, with guests moving between the lawn and the house, the string quartet continuing to provide background music for what appeared to be an entirely normal celebration. We parked in our original spot and walked back toward the festivities, both of us trying to appear casual despite the tension I could feel radiating from Lysander's every movement. I spotted Cordelia immediately, now changed into a simpler dress for dancing, laughing with Donovan near the garden pond as a photographer captured what would undoubtedly become one of their treasured wedding albums. "There you are," Aunt Genevieve's voice startled me, and I turned to find her approaching with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I was wondering where you disappeared to." "Just needed some air," I replied, hoping my voice sounded more natural than it felt. "It's such a beautiful celebration." "Indeed it is," she agreed, but something in her tone suggested layers of meaning I was only beginning to understand. "Cordelia has outdone herself with the planning. Everything is absolutely perfect." As she spoke, her gaze moved past us to where Harold Ashford stood with a small group near the house, engaged in what appeared to be pleasant conversation with several other guests. For just a moment, I thought I saw something calculating in her expression, but it was gone so quickly I couldn't be certain. "I should go congratulate the happy couple again," I said, using the excuse to distance myself from what felt like an increasingly charged conversation. As I walked toward Cordelia, I found myself studying every face, every interaction, searching for signs of hidden agendas or suppressed hostilities. The revelation Lysander had shared had transformed this elegant gathering into something far more complex and potentially dangerous than I'd imagined, and I realized that nothing about this day was as simple as it had appeared just a few hours earlier. Cordelia embraced me warmly when I approached, her face glowing with the particular radiance that comes from being the center of positive attention. "Evangeline, I was worried when I couldn't find you earlier. Did you see the cake?" Donovan insisted on chocolate raspberry, which I thought was too unconventional, but it's absolutely divine. "It's beautiful," I assured her, though I found myself studying Donovan's face as he joined our conversation. Had I simply never noticed before how carefully he seemed to choose his words, or was I now seeing calculation where none existed? "Your family has been so welcoming," Donovan said, his arm settling around Cordelia's waist with what appeared to be genuine affection. "I feel incredibly fortunate to be joining such a distinguished family." The word distinguished seemed to hang in the air with unexpected weight. I found myself wondering if it carried hidden meaning, if Donovan knew exactly how the Whitmore family's distinction had been achieved. "We're delighted to have you," I replied, though the words felt hollow in my mouth. "I hope you'll be very happy together." As we chatted about honeymoon plans and future family gatherings, I became increasingly aware of the undercurrents swirling around us. Lysander had positioned himself near the bar, where he could observe the various family groupings without appearing to do so deliberately. Aunt Genevieve moved between clusters of guests with the practiced grace of the experienced hostess, but I noticed she seemed to be paying particular attention to the Ashford family members. The afternoon progressed with agonizing normalcy. Toasts were offered, The cake was cut with appropriate ceremony, and the dancing continued as the sun began to set over the estate's manicured grounds. Yet beneath this veneer of celebration, I sensed tension building like atmospheric pressure before a storm. It was during the father-daughter dance that I first noticed something truly unsettling. As Cordelia waltzed with Uncle Percival, who was standing in for their deceased father, I watched Harold Ashford pull a small notebook from his jacket pocket and make what appeared to be careful notations while observing the festivities. The gesture seemed oddly methodical for a wedding guest, more like someone documenting evidence than someone enjoying a celebration. When the dance ended, I approached Lysander at the bar, needing to share my observation. "Did you see Harold with the notebook?" I whispered, positioning myself so we appeared to be having a casual conversation about drink preferences. "I did," he replied grimly. "I've been watching him for the past hour, and his behavior is becoming increasingly difficult to explain as normal wedding guest activity." "What do you mean?" "He's been taking photographs, but not the kind you'd expect at a wedding. He's focusing on architectural details of the house, family portraits in the main hall, even the cars in the driveway. And he's been asking very specific questions about family history, particularly about my grandfather's business activities." The implications of this behavior sent a chill through me. "Do you think he's gathering evidence?" "I think," Lysander said carefully, "that this entire wedding may have been orchestrated as an opportunity for reconnaissance." Before I could respond, we were interrupted by Beatrice Ashford, Donovan's sister, who approached with a bright smile that seemed slightly forced. "What a wonderful celebration," she said, though something in her tone suggested she was making conversation for reasons beyond simple politeness. "Your family certainly knows how to host an elegant event. This house is absolutely magnificent. I understand it's been in your family for generations?" "4 generations," Lysander confirmed, his voice neutral but his body language tense. "How fascinating," Beatrice continued. "And your family business, I understand that's equally well established? Donovan mentioned that your grandfather was quite the entrepreneur." The specificity of her questions confirmed my growing suspicions. This wasn't idle wedding chatter. This was information gathering. "My grandfather was indeed a businessman," Lysander replied carefully, "though I'm afraid the details of his enterprises would be rather dull for a celebration like this." Beatrice's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, I don't know about that. Family history can be quite fascinating, especially when it involves such remarkable success stories." The word remarkable carried the same strange weight I'd noticed in Donovan's earlier comment about our distinguished family. I was beginning to understand that the Ashford family's interest in our history was far from casual. As the evening progressed, I found myself cataloging an increasing number of troubling observations. Harold Ashford disappeared for nearly 20 minutes, during which time I noticed him emerge from the main house straightening his jacket as if he'd been somewhere he shouldn't have been. Judith Ashford engaged Aunt Genevieve in what appeared to be an intense conversation near the garden gazebo, their heads bent together in discussion that seemed far too serious for a wedding reception. Most disturbing of all was Donovan's behavior during the traditional bouquet toss. Instead of participating in the light-hearted ceremony, he positioned himself where he could observe the female family members, his expression analytical rather than celebratory. When Cordelia's young cousin Penelope caught the bouquet, Donovan approached her with questions about her engagement to a young man from another prominent local family. The pieces of a deeply disturbing puzzle were beginning to form in my mind. What if this wasn't simply about revenge for past wrongs? What if the Ashford family had identified the Whitmore family as part of a larger scheme involving multiple wealthy families in the region? As the reception moved into its final hours, with guests beginning to make their farewells and the catering staff starting to clear tables, I realized that our family was potentially facing a crisis far more complex than we'd initially understood. The revelation about my grandfather-in-law's criminal activities might be only the beginning of our troubles. not the entirety of them. I was standing near the garden pond, ostensibly admiring the way the market lights reflected on the water's surface, when I overheard a conversation that confirmed my worst fears. Harold and Beatrice Ashford were speaking in low voices near the rose garden, apparently unaware that their words could carry across the still evening air. "The documentation is even more extensive than we hoped," Harold was saying. "4 generations of detailed financial records, family correspondence, business contracts, everything we need to establish the pattern." "And the other families?" Beatrice asked. "The Hollingsworth connection is solid, and we have preliminary evidence regarding the Pemberton estate acquisition. This marriage gives us access to social circles that would otherwise be impossible to penetrate." My blood turned to ice as I realized the full scope of what we were dealing with. This wasn't just about seeking justice for Harold's father, or even revenge against the Whitmore family. This was about using Cordelia's marriage as a pathway to investigate and potentially expose multiple families in our social circle. I moved closer, desperate to hear more while remaining unnoticed. "Donovan has done excellent work," Harold continued. "Cordelia trusts him completely, and through her, he's gained access to family documents, social connections, even private conversations about business matters. The information he's gathered over the past 8 months is extraordinary." 8 months. I thought about Donovan's courtship of Cordelia, how it had seemed so romantic and perfectly timed. Now I understood that every gesture, every shared confidence, every expression of love had potentially been calculated to serve a larger agenda. The wedding was the perfect opportunity to assess the full extent of their assets and social connections, Beatrice added. "Did you see how many prominent families attended today? The guest list alone provides us with a roadmap for future investigations." I had heard enough. Moving as quietly as possible, I backed away from the rose garden and found Lysander, who was helping coordinate the departure of elderly relatives who needed assistance reaching their cars. "We need to talk," I said urgently. "Privately. Now." Something in my expression must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation, because he immediately delegated the task to Uncle Percival and followed me to a secluded area near the garden shed. "I overheard Harold and Beatrice talking," I whispered, glancing around to ensure we weren't being observed. "This is much worse than we thought. They're not just interested in our family. They're using this marriage to investigate multiple wealthy families in the region. Donovan has been gathering information on Cordelia for 8 months, probably since they first met." Lysander's face went pale. "Are you certain?" I repeated what I'd heard, watching his expression grow increasingly grim as the implications became clear. "We have to warn Cordelia," I said. "She has a right to know that her marriage may be built on deception." "Do we?" Lysander asked quietly. "If we're wrong, we destroy her happiness and her marriage based on suspicion and overhead conversations. If we're right, we potentially trigger a confrontation that could expose our family to legal consequences for crimes committed 70 years ago." The moral complexity of our situation was staggering. How could we protect Cordelia without potentially destroying our entire family? How could we remain silent when she might be the victim of an elaborate fraud? "There has to be another way," I said desperately. "Some way to investigate further before making irreversible decisions." "Perhaps," Lysander agreed, though his voice lacked conviction. "But we need professional help. Legal advice, private investigators, experts who can help us understand exactly what we're dealing with and what our options are." As we spoke, I could see the reception winding down around us. Cordelia and Donovan were making their rounds, thanking guests for attending and accepting final congratulations. They looked so happy, so genuinely in love, that I found it almost impossible to believe that their entire relationship might be built on manipulation and deception. Yet as I watched them together, I began to notice details that took on new significance in light of what I'd learned. the way Donovan's eyes would scan the crowd even while accepting well wishes. How he seemed to remember specific details about family members he'd supposedly just met. The careful way he guided conversations toward topics that elicited information about business matters and family connections. The last of the guests were departing when Cordelia approached us, still radiant despite the long day. "Thank you both so much for everything," she said, embracing first me and then Lysander. "I know today was perfect because you were here to support us." "It was a beautiful celebration," I managed to say, though the words felt like betrayal. "We're so happy for you. Donovan and I are staying at the house tonight before we leave for our honeymoon tomorrow," she continued. "I want to spend one more evening in the gardens before we go to Italy." The thought of her spending the night alone with Donovan, unaware of the potential danger she might be in, made my stomach clench with anxiety. Yet what could we say? How could we voice suspicions that might be entirely unfounded? As we said our final goodbyes and walked to our car, I felt as though I was abandoning Cordelia to an unknown fate. The weight of our family's hidden history, combined with the uncertainty about Donovan's true intentions, created a burden of knowledge that seemed almost unbearable. The drive home passed in tense silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts about the revelations of the day and the impossible decisions we faced. By the time we reached our house, darkness had fallen completely, and the normalcy of our suburban neighborhood felt surreal after the emotional intensity of the afternoon and evening. Inside our home, surrounded by familiar furniture and family photographs, the events at Cordelia's wedding began to feel almost dreamlike. Had we really uncovered evidence of criminal activity dating back decades? Had we really overheard conversations suggesting that Cordelia's marriage was part of an elaborate fraud? The comfortable routine of checking locks and turning off lights made it tempting to dismiss our concerns as paranoid speculation. But as I prepared for bed, my mind continued to race through the implications of what we'd learned. If our suspicions were correct, the morning would bring new challenges that could fundamentally alter not just our lives, but the lives of everyone in our extended family. The decisions we made in the coming days could determine whether we preserved our family's reputation and security or watched everything we'd built crumble under the weight of long-buried secrets. I lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine how we could navigate the treacherous waters ahead. Outside, the summer night was peaceful and quiet, but I knew that when morning came, we would have to begin making choices that would shape the rest of our lives. The wedding that had begun as a celebration of love and new beginnings had revealed itself to be something far more complex and potentially dangerous. And as I finally drifted toward sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing at the edge of a precipice, with no clear path forward and no way back to the innocence we'd lost forever. The next morning brought no relief from the anxiety that had plagued my restless sleep. I woke before dawn with a profound sense of unease, as if some primitive part of my consciousness was warning me that danger still lurked nearby. Lysander was already awake beside me, staring at the ceiling with the hollow-eyed expression of someone who had spent the night wrestling with impossible decisions. "We need to call Aunt Genevieve," I said without preamble, knowing that further delay would only compound our problems. "Whatever legal advice she's seeking, we need to be part of that conversation." Lysander nodded grimly and reached for his phone. It was barely 6 in the morning, but when dealing with potential family catastrophe, normal social conventions seemed irrelevant. To my surprise, Aunt Genevieve answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and alert despite the early hour. "I've been expecting your call," she said without waiting for explanation. "I assume yesterday's revelations have left you with questions that require immediate attention." "Among other things," Lysander replied carefully. "We need to discuss what we observed at the reception, particularly regarding the Ashford family's behavior." There was a long pause before Aunt Genevieve responded. "I think it would be best if we met in person. Can you be at my house by 7:30? I've already contacted Harrison Blackwell, and he's agreed to join us for an emergency consultation. Harrison Blackwell had served as the Whitmore family attorney for over 20 years, handling everything from business contracts to estate planning with discretion and competence. If Aunt Genevieve had summoned him for an emergency meeting, the situation was even more serious than I'd realized. We dressed quickly and drove through the quiet suburban streets toward Aunt Genevieve's house, a stately Georgian colonial that had been her home for nearly 40 years. The morning air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of dew-dampened grass and the last lingering roses of summer, but I found no comfort in the peaceful setting. Everything felt charged with potential disaster. Aunt Genevieve met us at the door, her usually impeccable appearance showing signs of a sleepless night. Her silver hair was less perfectly arranged than usual, and she wore a simple navy dress rather than her typical formal attire. Most tellingly, she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone bracing for impact. "Harrison is already here," she said, leading us through her elegant foyer toward the library where she conducted family business. "I've briefed him on the contents of my father's letter, though there are additional complications we need to discuss." Harrison Blackwell rose from one of the leather armchairs as we entered, his expression grave but professionally composed. At 62, he had the distinguished appearance of someone who had spent decades dealing with the complex legal problems of wealthy families. But I could see concern in his eyes that went beyond routine professional obligation. "Lysander, Evangeline," he said, shaking our hands formally. "Genevieve has shared some troubling information that requires immediate attention. Before we discuss potential legal ramifications, I need to understand exactly what you observed yesterday that prompted this urgent meeting." I found myself recounting the overheard conversation between Harold and Beatrice Ashford, their suspicious behavior throughout the reception, and the growing evidence that Donovan's relationship with Cordelia might be built on deception. As I spoke, I watched Harrison's expression grow increasingly troubled. "The pattern you're describing suggests a sophisticated long-term operation," he said when I finished. "If the Ashford family has indeed been investigating multiple wealthy families in the region, using Donovan's marriage as a means of gaining access to private information, we're dealing with something far more serious than simple revenge for past wrongs." Aunt Genevieve poured coffee from a silver service, her movements precise despite the obvious tension in the room. "There's something else you need to know," she said, settling into her chair with obvious reluctance. "After our conversation yesterday, I contacted a private investigator I've worked with previously to conduct a preliminary background check on the Ashford family." She reached for a manila folder on the side table, extracting several pages of what appeared to be investigative reports. "Donovan Ashford exists, but his background doesn't match what he's told Cordelia about his life and career. The architectural firm he claims to own is registered to a different Donovan Ashford, a man in his 70s who has no connection to our Donovan. The Portland address he's given corresponds to a mail forwarding service, not a residence or business." The implications of this revelation hit me like a physical blow. "So he's been lying about everything?" "It appears so," Harrison confirmed. "More troubling still, preliminary searches suggest that Harold and Beatrice Ashford may also be using fabricated identities. If these people have assumed false names specifically to target your family, we're dealing with a criminal conspiracy that extends far beyond financial investigation." I thought about Cordelia, probably waking up in the main house at that very moment, beside a man whose entire identity might be fabricated. The romantic honeymoon they'd planned, the future they'd discussed building together, the trust she'd placed in him completely, all of it potentially built on lies so elaborate they constituted criminal fraud. "We have to warn her," I said desperately. "She could be in actual physical danger." "That's precisely what we cannot do," Harrison replied firmly. "If we alert Cordelia before we understand the full scope of what we're dealing with, we risk triggering a confrontation that could put her in greater danger while simultaneously destroying any chance we have of gathering evidence or controlling the Burr situation. Lysander leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped tightly together. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that we proceed very carefully, Harrison explained. First, we need to understand what the Ashford family, or whoever they really are, hopes to accomplish. Are they seeking financial compensation for past wrongs? Are they gathering evidence for potential criminal charges? Are they planning some form of blackmail or extortion? Until we know their ultimate objective, any action we take could inadvertently play into their hands. Aunt Genevieve set down her coffee cup with a sharp clink against the saucer. There's one more thing the private investigator discovered that complicates matters further. The real Harold Ashford, the man whose father was ruined by our grandfather's fraud, died 6 years ago in Seattle. The man who attended Cordelia's wedding yesterday is not Harold Ashford. The room fell silent as we absorbed this final piece of evidence that we were dealing with an elaborate deception. Every assumption we'd made about motivation and identity had been wrong. The people who had infiltrated our family weren't seeking justice for past wrongs. They were criminals engaged in identity theft and fraud for purposes we couldn't yet understand. How is this possible? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of the deception. How could they maintain such elaborate false identities? How could Cordelia not have noticed inconsistencies in Donovan's stories? People see what they want to see, Harrison replied gently. Cordelia wanted to believe she'd found lasting love after the disappointment of her first marriage. When someone presents a carefully constructed facade that aligns with our desires, we tend to overlook details that might otherwise raise questions. I thought about my own interactions with Donovan over the past 8 months. Had there been signs I'd missed? Moments when his stories didn't quite align, or his reactions seemed calculated rather than genuine? In retrospect, I could identify several instances that might have raised suspicions if I'd been looking for them. But at the time, I'd simply seen a charming man who seemed to genuinely care for my sister-in-law. "What's our next move?" Lysander asked, his voice heavy with the weight of responsibility. "We gather more information while maintaining the appearance of normalcy," Harrison replied. "The private investigator is conducting deeper background checks on all 3 individuals, but that will take time. Meanwhile, we need to find a way to monitor the situation at the estate without alerting them to our suspicions." "Cordelia and Donovan are supposed to leave for their honeymoon this afternoon," I said, suddenly realizing the implications. "If we let them go to Italy, we'll lose any chance of protecting her or gathering evidence." Aunt Genevieve looked troubled. "But if we prevent them from leaving without adequate justification, we reveal our suspicions and potentially trigger whatever plan they've been developing." The moral complexity of our situation felt overwhelming. Every choice carried enormous risks, both for Cordelia's immediate safety and for our family's long-term security. As we sat in that elegant library, surrounded by leather-bound books and family portraits that represented generations of Whitmore history, I realized that we were balanced on a knife's edge between protection and destruction. "There might be another way," I said slowly, an idea beginning to form. "What if we create a situation that requires them to postpone their departure? Something that seems natural and unavoidable but gives us more time to understand what we're dealing with?" Harrison looked intrigued. "What did you have in mind?" "A family emergency," I explained, my thoughts racing. "Something serious enough that Cordelia would feel obligated to stay, but not so dramatic that it appears contrived. If we can keep them here for another few days, the private investigator might uncover information that helps us determine our best course of action." Lysander was already shaking his head. "What kind of emergency could we fabricate that wouldn't require medical verification or create additional complications?" Before I could respond, Aunt Genevieve's phone rang. She glanced at the caller identification and frowned. "It's Cordelia," she said, looking puzzled. "Why would she be calling so early?" She answered the phone with her usual composed greeting, but as she listened to whatever Cordelia was saying, her expression grew increasingly alarmed. "Slow down, dear," she said. "Tell me exactly what happened." The one-sided conversation that followed filled me with growing dread. Aunt Genevieve made notes on a piece of paper while asking careful questions about timing and circumstances. When she finally hung up, her face was pale. "Donovan is gone," she announced. Cordelia woke up this morning and found a note saying he'd received an emergency call about his father's health and had to fly to Seattle immediately. He took his luggage and promised to contact her once he arrived, but that was 6 hours ago, and she hasn't heard anything. The implications of this development crashed over me in waves. If Donovan had fled, it suggested that something had triggered his departure. Either he'd accomplished whatever he'd set out to do, or he'd discovered that his deception was being investigated. "Did Cordelia mention anything about the house?" Harrison asked urgently. "Any signs that it had been searched or that documents were missing?" Aunt Genevieve consulted her notes. She said the study door was open when she came downstairs, though she was certain it had been closed when they went to bed. Some of the desk drawers were slightly open as well, but nothing appeared to be obviously missing. My stomach dropped as I realized what might have happened. The family papers you mentioned, the documents you found in the attic, where are they now? "In the study safe," Aunt Genevieve replied, then stopped as understanding dawned. Oh dear God. If he had access to the house overnight, if Cordelia told him about the family documents— "We need to get to the estate immediately," Harrison said, already rising from his chair. "If Donovan has fled with evidence of your grandfather's criminal activities, we could be facing exposure that extends far beyond family embarrassment." The drive to the estate passed in tense silence, each of us contemplating the potential disaster we might find waiting. I kept thinking about Cordelia's devastation at discovering her second marriage was apparently over before it had truly begun, but my concern for her emotional well-being was overshadowed by fear about what Donovan might have stolen during his final night in the house. We found Cordelia in the main drawing room, still in her robe and slippers, staring at her phone with the hollow expression of someone whose world had just collapsed around them. She looked up as we entered, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, but also filled with confusion that went beyond simple abandonment. "I don't understand what happened," she said, her voice small and lost. "Yesterday was perfect. He seemed so happy, so in love. How could he just disappear?" I sat beside her on the sofa, taking her hands in mine. "Tell us exactly what the note said." She reached for a piece of hotel stationery on the coffee table, her movements mechanical. "Emergency call about father's health. Flying to Seattle on first available flight. Will contact you soon. Love, D." The note was brief and impersonal, nothing like the romantic messages Donovan had been leaving for Cordelia throughout their courtship. More tellingly, it was handwritten in block letters, rather than the flowing script I'd seen him use when signing the guest book at yesterday's reception. "Cordelia," Lysander said gently, "we need to check the study. It's possible that some important family documents may be missing." Her confusion deepened. "Why would Donovan be interested in family documents? And why are you all here so early? This feels like more than coincidence." I exchanged glances with Lysander and Aunt Genevieve, realizing that we could no longer protect Cordelia from the truth. The situation had moved beyond speculation into confirmed criminal activity, and she deserved to understand what had been done to her. "There are things about yesterday's wedding that we need to explain," I said carefully. "Things about Donovan and his family that we've discovered since the reception." As gently as possible, we outlined what we'd learned about the fabricated identities, the suspicious behavior at the wedding, and the growing evidence that Donovan's entire relationship with her had been built on deception. I watched Cordelia's face cycle through disbelief, anger, hurt, and finally a kind of numb recognition as pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed began falling into place. The questions he asked about family history, she said slowly. I thought he was just interested in understanding his new family better, but he was always so specific about dates and business details. And he spent so much time in the study when he visited, claiming to admire the architecture. Harrison cleared his throat diplomatically. Cordelia, I need to ask you some difficult questions about what Donovan might have had access to during your relationship. Did you ever show him family documents, business records, anything that might contain sensitive historical information? Cordelia's face crumpled as understanding dawned. The photo albums, she whispered. I showed him all the old photo albums because he said he wanted to understand the family history. And last week, when Aunt Genevieve mentioned finding grandfather's papers in the attic, I told him about it. I thought it was just family history, something that might interest him. Aunt Genevieve stood abruptly, heading toward the study with determined steps. The rest of us followed, dreading what we might discover. The study door was indeed standing open, and several desk drawers showed signs of having been hastily searched. Most damning of all, the family safe stood open and empty. Everything's gone, Aunt Genevieve said, her voice hollow. Grandfather's letter, the legal documents, the correspondence with his victims, the detailed records of his fraudulent activities. Donovan has taken everything. The magnitude of our situation was staggering. Not only had Cordelia been victimized by an elaborate romantic fraud, but our family was now vulnerable to blackmail or criminal prosecution based on evidence that was entirely in the hands of people whose motivations and identities remained unknown. We have to contact the police, I said, though even as I spoke, I realized the complications this would create. And tell them what? Harrison asked grimly. That we've been the victims of theft involving documents that could incriminate our family in decades-old criminal activity? That we allowed strangers access to sensitive materials because we believed they were legitimate in-laws? Cordelia stood in the center of the ransacked study, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold her shattered world together. How could I have been so blind? She asked. How could I not have seen that everything about him was a lie? Because he was very good at what he did, I assured her, though my words felt inadequate in the face of her devastation. This wasn't your fault, Cordelia. You were targeted by professional criminals who had been planning this deception for months. My phone rang suddenly, the sound startling in the tense silence of the study. I glanced at the caller identification and felt my blood run cold. The call was coming from Donovan's phone. Should I answer it? I asked, looking to Harrison for guidance. He nodded grimly. Put it on speaker. Let's hear what he has to say. I accepted the call with trembling fingers, placing the phone on the desk so everyone could hear. Good morning, Evangeline, came Donovan's voice, though it sounded different somehow. Harder, more calculating than the charming tone I'd grown accustomed to. I trust you've discovered our little problem by now. Where are you? I demanded, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. That's not really relevant, he replied. What matters is what happens next. I have some documents that I believe belong to your family, documents that contain information that could be very embarrassing if they were to become public. The word embarrassing was clearly chosen to minimize the actual magnitude of what he held, evidence that could destroy our family's reputation and potentially lead to criminal prosecution, even decades after the original crimes. What do you want? Lysander asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Nothing unreasonable, Donovan replied smoothly. Simply compensation for the damage your grandfather did to my family and others like us. Consider it very delayed justice. But you're not Harold Ashford, Aunt Genevieve interjected. We know the real Harold Ashford died 6 years ago. There was a pause before Donovan laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. Very good. I wondered how long it would take you to figure that out. You're right, of course. But that doesn't change the fact that your grandfather destroyed real families, real lives. Someone needs to hold the Whitmore family accountable for those crimes. And you've appointed yourself judge and jury? Cordelia asked, finding her voice for the first time since the call began. I've appointed myself collector, he corrected. Justice delayed is not justice denied, merely justice with interest. Harrison leaned toward the phone. I'm Harrison Blackwell, the Whitmore family attorney. If you're seeking financial compensation for historical wrongs, there are legal channels for pursuing such claims. What you're doing constitutes theft and extortion. What I'm doing, Donovan replied, is giving your family the opportunity to handle this matter privately rather than publicly. I have enough evidence to file criminal complaints, civil lawsuits, and media reports that would destroy your reputation permanently. Or we can settle this quietly, between reasonable people. The threat was clear, and we all understood the impossible position it put us in. Paying what amounted to extortion would only invite future demands, but refusing could result in the exposure and prosecution he was threatening. How much are you demanding? Lysander asked, though I could see the revulsion in his expression at having to negotiate with our blackmailer. $5 million, Donovan replied without hesitation. A modest amount considering the scope of your grandfather's crimes and the interest that's accumulated over 70 years. The money should be transferred to an account I'll specify by Friday, or the documents become public. $5 million. The amount was substantial, but not impossible for our family to manage, which suggested that Donovan had done his research carefully enough to know exactly what we could afford. And what guarantee do we have that this payment ends the matter? Harrison asked. You have my word, Donovan replied, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of trusting the word of someone who had built an 8-month romantic relationship on completely fabricated identity. That's not sufficient, Harrison said firmly. If we're going to consider any form of settlement, we need ironclad legal guarantees that all documents will be returned and that no future claims will be made. You're hardly in a position to dictate terms, Donovan pointed out. But I'm a reasonable man. I'll return all documents upon receipt of payment, and I have no interest in maintaining ongoing contact with your family once this matter is resolved. After several more minutes of tense negotiation, we agreed that Harrison would have 24 hours to review our options and respond with a proposal. Donovan would call back at the same time tomorrow to finalize arrangements. When the call ended, we sat in stunned silence, each grappling with the reality of our situation. We were being extorted by criminals who had infiltrated our family through an elaborate romantic fraud, and our options were all terrible. Can we trust him to honor any agreement? I asked Harrison. Absolutely not, he replied without hesitation. Even if we pay the money and he returns the documents, there's nothing preventing him from making copies or returning with additional demands in the future. Cordelia had been quiet throughout the negotiation, but now she looked up with an expression I'd never seen before, determined and slightly frightening. There's another option, she said quietly. We let him think we're going to pay, but we set a trap. Harrison looked skeptical. What kind of trap? He's expecting us to be frightened and compliant victims, Cordelia explained, her voice growing stronger. But he made one crucial mistake. He genuinely seemed to care about me, at least sometimes. I could tell when his emotions were real versus when he was performing. I wasn't sure where she was heading with this line of thinking, but something in her tone suggested she was developing a plan that went beyond passive victimhood. If I contacted him privately, she continued, claimed to be devastated by the discovery of his true identity, but still willing to help him if he'd give me another chance, he might be arrogant enough to meet with me. Absolutely not, Lysander said. Immediately. You're not putting yourself in danger for the sake of recovering those documents. I'm already in danger, Cordelia pointed out. My marriage was fraudulent, my home has been burglarized, and my family is being blackmailed. The only question is whether I'm going to be a passive victim or take some control over the situation. Harrison looked thoughtful. If Cordelia could arrange a meeting under controlled circumstances, with proper surveillance and backup, we might be able to gather evidence of the extortion while also determining whether he has accomplices we haven't identified. The plan that emerged over the next several hours was complex and risky, but it offered our only realistic chance of resolving the situation without either paying extortion or facing public exposure. Cordelia would contact Donovan privately, claiming emotional devastation, but professing continued love despite his deception. She would offer to help him escape with the money if he would give their relationship another chance. The goal was to arrange a meeting where we could gather evidence of the criminal conspiracy while also determining the location of the stolen documents. Harrison would coordinate with law enforcement, though we would need to be extremely careful about what information we shared to avoid triggering the very prosecution we were trying to prevent. 2 days later, I found myself crouched in the back of a surveillance van parked 3 blocks from the downtown hotel where Cordelia had arranged to meet Donovan. She was wearing a wire and carrying a tracking device, but I still felt sick with anxiety about the risks she was taking. Through the surveillance equipment, we could hear her entering the hotel lobby, her heels clicking against marble floors as she made her way to the elevator. She sounded nervous but determined, exactly the right combination for someone who had supposedly decided to abandon her family in favor of love. Room 412, we heard her tell someone, presumably the elevator operator or a fellow passenger. The conversation that followed was unlike anything I could have imagined. Donovan, or whatever his real name was, seemed genuinely surprised by Cordelia's willingness to see him again, and for several minutes, their dialogue had the quality of a real relationship discussion rather than a criminal negotiation. "I know you lied to me," Cordelia said, her voice soft but steady. "But I also know that what we had was real, at least sometimes. I could feel it when you stopped performing and let me see who you really were." "Cordelia," he replied, and there was something almost vulnerable in his tone. "You don't understand what you're asking. This isn't a situation you can simply walk away from once you know the truth." "Then help me understand," she said. "Tell me who you really are, what you really want, and let me decide if I can live with that truth." What emerged over the next hour was a story more complex than any of us had anticipated. The man we'd known as Donovan was actually Marcus Thorne, a private investigator who specialized in historical financial crimes. He had been hired by a consortium of families who believed they had been victimized by various wealthy families throughout the mid-20th century. The Whitmore family was just one of several targets in what amounted to a systematic investigation into generational wealth that might have been obtained through criminal means. The romantic relationship with Cordelia had begun as professional necessity, but had evolved into something more complicated, a development that was causing problems with his employers. "They expected me to get the documents and disappear," Marcus explained. "But I couldn't bring myself to vanish from your life without explanation. Even knowing that everything between us started as deception, what we became was real." "Who are they?" Cordelia asked. "Who hired you?" The answer revealed a network of individuals and organizations that had been systematically targeting wealthy families throughout the region, using various forms of infiltration and investigation to gather evidence of historical crimes. Some were legitimate victims seeking justice. Others were opportunistic criminals hoping to profit from past wrongs. As the conversation continued, it became clear that Marcus was as much a victim of the conspiracy as our family was. He had been hired for what he believed was legitimate investigative work, only to discover that his employers intended to use the evidence for extortion rather than legal justice. "I can't let them destroy your family," he said finally. But I also can't simply return the documents without putting myself in danger from people who have invested significant time and money in this operation. Cordelia's response was immediate and decisive. Then we find another way. We work together to expose the real criminals while protecting both our families. What followed was the most elaborate sting operation I could have imagined, coordinated between Marcus, our family, law enforcement, and ultimately several other families who had been targeted by the same conspiracy. The stolen documents became evidence in a much larger criminal case that resulted in the arrest of 12 individuals involved in the extortion network. The legal resolution took nearly 6 months, during which time our family's historical crimes were indeed exposed, but in the context of a criminal investigation that focused on the present-day extortion rather than the past fraud. We faced civil lawsuits from several families, which we settled privately, and we established a foundation dedicated to providing restitution to victims of historical financial crimes. The most surprising development was the evolution of Cordelia's relationship with Marcus. Despite the deception that had brought them together, they had indeed developed genuine feelings that survived the revelation of his true identity and purpose. They spent months in counseling, working through the complex emotions and trust issues created by their unusual beginning, but ultimately decided to build something real from the ashes of what had started as fraud. Their second wedding, 18 months later, was a small private ceremony attended only by immediate family. There were no elaborate decorations or expensive champagne, no string quartets or multi-course dinners. Instead, there was honesty, vulnerability, and the hard-won understanding that love built on truth, however painful, was more valuable than any romantic fantasy. As I watched Cordelia exchange vows with Marcus in our family's garden, surrounded by the people who had helped them navigate the most difficult period of their lives, I reflected on how crisis had ultimately strengthened rather than destroyed our family bonds. We had faced the worst aspects of our history and found ways to make amends. We had been victimized by criminals and found the courage to fight back. Most importantly, we had learned that sometimes the most unexpected circumstances can lead to the most profound transformations. The revelation of our grandfather's crimes had been devastating, but it had also freed us from the burden of maintaining a lie. The money we'd inherited carried the weight of old wrongs, but we now had the opportunity to use it for better purposes. The threat to our family's reputation had been terrifying, but surviving it had taught us that our value wasn't dependent on maintaining perfect appearances. Standing in that garden, watching my sister-in-law marry a man who had initially deceived her, but had ultimately chosen truth over profit, I understood that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you really does lead you exactly where you need to be. The wedding that had revealed our family's darkest secrets had also shown us our capacity for growth, forgiveness, and redemption. The future remained uncertain, but it was built on honesty rather than hidden shame, and that made all the difference.